I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. We are fully in the season of school budget politics. MCPS is asking for about $300 million more than it did last year, which is about 10%. 10% is also the amount by which County Executive Mark Elrich has proposed a property tax increase. With all of this in play and anxiety around pandemic learning loss growing, I thought it would be interesting to ask a close expert observer of MCPS, former Superintendent Josh Starr, who even after the contentious end to his tenure as superintendent chose to remain in the county as a resident and as an MCPS parent while he headed an educational consulting business, which has recently acquired the entity that administers the well-known MAP tests. We will talk about the circumstances of his contentious departure, his book on school leadership, and the persistent challenges in a large and diverse school district like MCPS.
Drinks were cool, and all of the guests were fools. Watch them shaking hands at the pool party. All of the sandwiches served for the special occasion observed, passed on from bare hand to hand at the pool party.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society moving precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Cat's Can, a band of three friends who have known each other since kindergarten in Vienna, Northern Virginia. Paul Chaparis on bass and vocals, Mason Shelby on keyboards and vocals, and Kevin Kingsley on guitars. Their art pop style of music and satirical lyrics can be found on all good streaming sites.
The dirty bath water was tainted. All of the fools have now fainted. Wash your shaking hands, they were foolhardy.
In the news this week, Roy McGrath, once chief of staff to former Republican governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, was shot and killed by the FBI this week in Tennessee, where he was hiding after having missed a court date in a fraud case, where he was accused of improperly receiving $233,000 from a state agency. McGrath was a Charles County Republican who rose through government and party circles to become the deputy chief of staff to Larry Hogan in 2015. In 2016, Hogan appointed him as the head of the state agency, which is used as a contracting entity on behalf of the state. He returned to be chief of staff to Hogan in 2020, which is when he engineered to get the money in improper severance pay. He was charged in court for fraud, and 3 weeks ago missed a court date, leading to a manhunt and finally to his death. The drama of this tragedy will surely lead to a movie soon. I mentioned the 2024 MCPS budget ask. It's $296 million more than last year's. Of that, almost $272 million needs to come from the county. Despite state support growing under the provisions of the blueprint for Maryland's future law, MCPS says that it is in fact going to get $5 million less this year. In their letter to County Executive and County Council, MCPS Superintendent Manifa McKnight and Board of Education President Carla Silvestri write that the additional spending money would go toward improving reading and math scores and teacher and staff recruitment and retention. The extra money for teacher and staff recruitment and retention is mandated in the blueprint legislation. The salary for starting teachers Maryland-wide must now be $60,000, which means that Montgomery County must pay significantly above that to match the higher cost of living when teachers have a choice of making $60,000 in counties with lower costs of living. The knock-on effects on salary scales for experienced teachers will be significant. The letter also brings focus to the idea of learning loss, a pandemic-era argument that has been gaining ground in education politics. Superintendent McKnight's letter to the Board of Education elaborates on this idea, but, interestingly, proclaims that the initiative is revenue neutral. I am assuming this means that MCPS will invest more in improving reading and math test results, which my guest, former Superintendent Starr, says is part of the problem. There is a large debate in Maryland education and public education nationally between the relative weight of money and teaching and administrative practices in delivering improved education. The blueprint for Maryland's future, which has received widespread support from around the state, does both, and as a result has been called a transformative piece of legislation. But with both budgets and uplifted practices, change has been hard. And there is going to be finger-pointing over whether there wasn't enough money or the viability of changes to teaching and administrative practices is what came up short. By focusing on improving test scores over other areas this year, it may signal a victory of the short term over structural change. Meanwhile, the county executive, Mark Elrich, has proposed a 10% increase in property taxes, and council members Kristen Mink and Will Joando have proposed increased recordation taxes to fund schools. Recordation taxes are collected when properties are sold. If these tax increases don't find support on the county council, something will need to be cut and the school district's ask reduced. Expect the politics to heat up the next few weeks. There is another wrinkle on the issue of school budgets. 2022 numbers from the U.S. Census Bureau showed that Maryland lost population this year over last year. A small amount, but still a loss. Montgomery County has lost population for 2 years in a row. MCPS enrollment dropped by over 5,000 in 2021 and then has picked up somewhat and is now just over 160,000. Prior to the pandemic, there was expectation of more rapid growth. The slower rate of growth, but still growth, means expected budget numbers will need to be adjusted. Enrollment numbers ultimately determine the money the school district gets because budgets are calculated on spending per pupil basis. You are listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. I'll be back with former MCPS Superintendent and Education Consultant Josh Starr.
Member of the lizard race. They said my daddy was
Josh Starr, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation, Sunil.
In 2015, your contract as MCPS superintendent was in question, and the school board was divided over renewing your contract, and you decided not to go forward. But since then, you have remained in Montgomery County and have occasionally commented publicly on MCPS matters. What do you think are some central and persistent problems MCPS has had since the time you were superintendent?
So I think that we should think about it in two different ways. One is the problems that any large, very diverse system has. School districts are very, very complex entities to run and to manage and to transform. And certainly in the last few years with COVID, that's been, that's plagued everybody. So issues around equity, issues around addressing the needs of the most vulnerable and impacted kids, while also ensuring that there's a consistent excellence agenda. I think, we're seeing that around the country, and Montgomery County is similar to everywhere else, despite the fact that, certainly under my predecessor, they felt that their stuff didn't stink, so to speak. But I think there's I think that the challenge in Montgomery County is one of the ability to innovate. And, there's sort of, I used to say when I was superintendent, there's kind of a race to be second in the county. And there's a lot of small ball stuff, that is important, but not part of a real transformational agenda that rethinks how we should be engaging kids in teaching and learning. I happen to so I have a ninth grader, so I'm still on the lists of, I get all the communications, and I got the email yesterday about the 5 things to know, and it said something about the strategic plan. I'm like, I'm actually kind of curious as to what's in there, because quite frankly, I don't spend that much time looking at it. And I looked at like the value statements and all that. That's the stuff that we did back in 2011 when I first got here, 2011, 2012. They're still using a lot of the same things that we laid down. And I'm not saying that to say, to say, oh, look at how great things were when I was there. Other people can judge that. What I'm saying is like, and look, I think the value statements that we created were good, but they're still using them. Like, what's the next level of work? What's the next thing? How do we transform? And I think the county in general, which does, serves people and its citizens really, really well. I'd like to see a little more innovation. I'd like to see pushing the envelope. I'd like to see some changes in governance. And I think those are some of the problems that continue to kind of bind the school system to the old ways of doing business. When I was starting as superintendent, I was learning the capital improvement process, right? Which is a huge process, building new buildings all the time to absorb new kids, rethinking district lines, all the stuff that goes into it. It's very, very collaborative, which is great. But I having come from a district that had a very intentional desegregation and integration policy dating back to the 1970s, I was used to sort of a different approach when it came to drawing district lines. And so I remember asking for the guidance on how district lines were drawn. And it was very kind of loose categorizations or loose guidance on here's some of the things you should consider in the hopes of having more integrated schools, rather than saying, no, this is what our stake in the ground is. This is what we believe. This is what we want to achieve. And so I feel like there is a constant effort to get more people to the table, to have collaborative decisions, which is great. I'm a big believer in stakeholder engagement, but at some point you got to move an agenda that's going to serve kids and communities. And I just think that there's some hesitancy to do that.
What is the balance between stakeholder engagement and decision efficiency that you saw in MCPS, and where were you coming from that it was better?
The ethos in Montgomery County, at least in the schools, was much more around providing information to people so that they would support and understand rather than engaging with them. I always use Peter Block's term about knee-to-knee conversations, right? Where you're sitting in a circle, you're just talking about the issues at hand. And I feel like a lot of the community engagement had been very one-directional. And I know, I inherited that kind of culture. I think we did a lot to try to break it down. And then there are the people, typically white people, typically wealthier people with a lot more political power, who are very good at exercising their entitlement, very good at exercising their political power, very good at threatening to leave, right? And very good at ensuring that their interests and needs rise to the top, even if it's around claims of, equity and whatever else, the same people who would have voted for Obama a third time. And so I think that the engagement dynamics are still slanted, as they are in most places, towards the most powerful. And there's also architecture around collaborative decision-making. I mean, when I was here, big commitment to interest-based negotiations with the unions. Unions and parents were involved in budget decisions. I don't know if they still are. I met monthly with, the special ed interest group, the gifted and talented interest group. We set up some groups for African-American and Latino and Asian parent involvement. But whether or not that sort of penetrates the kind of, the tractor beam of the status quo that exists, because I think a lot of people in the system believe that they know better, is hard to say. Right. So you can build a lot of opportunities for people to get engaged, but to really have them involved in collaborative decision making is a lot tougher.
So those groups that you made, the Asian American groups, the Latino groups, the African American groups still exist. What does not exist is the deputies committee of the deputy superintendent, the chief of staff, and the union chiefs, for example. That committee that was in place when you were there, that has not existed.
Right.
When you talk about sort of knee-to-knee conversation, right? As a political scientist, I see this kind of engagement as actually bargaining, right? That you're sitting there and you're saying, okay, you want X, I want Y. Can we meet at X upon 2? Right? So that's the essential argument, right? But you're right. MCPS has this kind of radio voice.
That's right.
And how do you tackle that? I mean, it seems like it's very difficult to move that. And when MCPS talks in this sort of, I will educate you, first of all, the language is impenetrable. I cannot understand it. And secondly, it's comes off as condescending.
Yep. So 2 quick stories. When I first got to the district, I saw that there was that we would give the Board of Education information in what I would call Russian novels, right? And sometimes at the last minute. And I had learned under my predecessor, and the way I always did business was, you want to give the board insight, not information. You want to keep it to like 2 pages. You want to make sure there's a regular cadence to when you're putting information out there. You want to, because you want them to understand the strategy, right? But the idea was actually to kind of obfuscate, to show only the good stuff in some ways, quite frankly. And so, we tried to change that. But I also remember being at a board meeting in public and saying that I think it was, a significant number of kids go to Montgomery College, right? Which isn't something we talk a lot about, right? But in fact, a significant number of graduates go to Montgomery College for their higher education. And 63% of kids who enrolled in Montgomery College needed remediation in mathematics, which is 10% better than most other districts, but it was still 63%. And I remember afterwards, their board member said, thank you. No one has ever sort of stated the truth about where we are, right? And some of our issues. And there's this sort of belief, I think, that a lot of leaders have, and I get it. I mean, I get it in school districts. It's really hard to be vulnerable. It's really hard to say, oh, man, this isn't working, right? Look at the recent shootings at Michigan State, right? No one's calling for the Michigan State chancellor or president to step down. That happens in a school district, you're going for the superintendent's head. So I understand why people aren't public.
What is the difference, though? What is that difference?
So I think it's twofold. One is I think that people see public education as a private commodity, not a public good. And they don't realize that they're part of this, they're buying this larger ecosystem that should support everybody, not just what they, not just their kids according to their home values. I think that there is an urgency and intensity around the public education experience and a nervousness that people have because they know how critical it is for their kids to be successful. But once you've chosen a college, it's like, okay, cool. You're going to university, and I'm going to be able, I'm paying for a certain experience that my kid's going to get. I don't know if that's a great answer to that question, and I don't know if I know enough about. I'd have to think more about what the difference is, but I know that superintendents heads are on the chopping block when it comes to anything, right? And if it's something that's a societal issue like a shooting, you still blame the superintendent, right? Whereas it just seems like that doesn't happen in other domains.
What societal issue was at stake when your contract renewal was up? What was the issue that was sort of that put your head on the chopping block?
Well, you'd have to ask the people that didn't support me. Mike Durso, who had been a principal in the district, was a longstanding member of the Board of Education, well known in the district. Not quite sure what his issues were with me, quite frankly. He pretty much organized people, against me. He also had a longstanding relationship with my deputy, who he wanted to slot in, and that was Kim Statham, who he wanted to slot in as the next superintendent of schools. I think that there was probably, an issue of control, right? The previous superintendent had been, very much in control of everything in the organization at all times. And I was brought in as a very different kind of leader, much more collaborative, much more we had a real commitment to shared governance, but I'm not going to be controlled, right? You can't run a $2.5 billion business with, an organization with 22,000 employees, and have to accede to the whims of board members at different times. So that was that. I think for Judy Daca, who at the time was quite ill, and she said, I was told, again, this was reported to me, that she said in a closed door meeting of the board that before I die, I want to see a Black woman as superintendent of schools. Again, I was told that. I did not witness it myself, but I was told that, and again, she was quite ill at the time, and Mike convinced her that Kim would be the next Sue. Rebecca Smondrowski got on the board not liking me for whatever reason. She very much had, very particular interests and wanted me to deal with very kind of picayune situations that were not necessarily appropriate for the superintendent to be dealing with, right?
What's an example?
Oh gosh, it was the kind of thing of like, I heard in this school that this teacher isn't doing well, or did something to a kid, right? It was that kind of like constant. It was like, oh, you're calling a snow day, you should let me know beforehand. It was that kind of like micromanagement, and again, wanting very particular control over what we were doing. Didn't understand the role of a board member as you're part of a team. And I know that, I
Did
mean,
you try assigning somebody to answer her questions like
well,
those
the
kinds
board
of
does
questions?
that, right? I mean, and the board worked very hard under Shirley Bramman, Chris Barkley, Pat O'Neill, may she rest in peace, Phil Kaufman, to say, Rebecca, here's the way it works. The same when Jill got on the board, right? When Jill Orman first, she wanted certain things to happen immediately, and be addressed. And I was like, you got to get the votes, right? A superintendent can't respond to the whims and desires of one board member. You work as a unit, right? And that wasn't satisfying to some people that wanted to see things happen very quickly, or not very quickly, according to what they thought, not according to what the board thought. And that's not how school districts work.
Okay, so what did you learn about the nature of school and school district leadership from this entire experience?
Well, let me answer that question a couple of different ways. So I think about what I could have or should have done differently, or what I misjudged, right? And the thing that I would say I misjudged is the gap between what they said they wanted and what they were ready for. Again, coming from my predecessor, 12 years of very top-down management, very tight control. And it was actually Mark Elrich, when he was on the county council before he was county executive, said, Josh did I'm paraphrasing, he did exactly what they asked him to do, right? Be much more collaborative, shared governance, more community engagement, more innovation, right? But what they were so used to, this kind of top-down approach, that they, I think, weren't able, and I think there were some people in the system as well, weren't able to reconcile with what they were used to what they wanted. And, and I think there were some principals, quite frankly, and probably some central office leaders who would say to me, I'm a good soldier. Tell me what to do, pretty much. And I was like, that's not the kind of leadership we need. So there are some principals that did start doing some amazing things, creative, innovative, because they're like, great, I've got clear stakes in the ground, non-negotiables, but I get an opportunity to innovate. Other folks are like, tell me what to do, right? And I think some of those, may have complained to board members. But I think that what I would have done differently, and part of what I learned, is that despite my annoyance at the really, what's the word I'm looking for? Very small-minded aspect, or small-minded desires of some of the board members, if I had given in on them a little more, maybe things would have turned out right. And maybe I should have done a little more horse trading and not relied on the board to police itself. We had designed a shared governance model that was baked into my contract, that was outstanding. It was the kind of thing that could have become a national model, quite frankly.
Speak to that a little bit. What are the elements of that?
So in my contract, it was required that the board do a self-evaluation before they evaluate me. They had never really evaluated Jerry, and they had never done a self-evaluation, right, where they actually look at themselves. We had quarterly, I forget exactly what we called them, as kind of touch base meetings, right, to make sure that we just kind of talked, we spent time kind of talking through the big stuff that was going on in the system. I had a weekly meeting with the board chair and vice chair to go through the agenda, but again, also feedback back and forth. What are you hearing out there? And then every 6 weeks, I think it was, I had what we called 3-on-1s or 2-on-1s, where a couple of the board members would come in, meet with me. Again, we go through stuff. What are you hearing out there? What's going on? Here's what I'm thinking about.
You wrote a book on school leadership where you identified certain principles of how school leaders should work. Can you ground those general principles in the MCPS context? So, for example, with respect to teaching and learning, what is it about teaching and learning in MCPS that a superintendent has to sort of understand?
So, so in my previous district, Stamford, Connecticut, which is almost the exact same demographics as Montgomery County, but a tenth of the size. When I got there, there was a teaching and learning issue, no standards, no curriculum, no assessment. So you had to build all that, right? In Montgomery County, it was the opposite. There's so much curriculum, there's so much stuff, right? There's an architecture around it. But it was interesting when my kids enrolled in, when we got here, my two older kids were, I think, third and fourth grade, and they were in Burning Tree Elementary School, considered a great school. Coming from, they had spent 1 year in Stanford and a few years before that in Brooklyn, New York, in PS 321. The literacy work they were being asked to do in Burning Tree Elementary in 2011 paled in comparison to what they were doing in Brooklyn and in Stanford, right? It was focused on BCRs, brief constructed responses, right? Which does lead to better test scores. It doesn't lead to really deep exploration of literacy, right? It's not grounded in the science of reading and all that. So the teaching and learning issue, like what should great literacy instruction look like for all kids? That's not something that we were really talking about or doing, other than, well, we know we got to pass the state test, and now we got Common Core, and we got to make sure that our instruction is aligned. So that would be a teaching and learning challenge.
But how, in fact, do you do it?
Well, so the issue is in MCPS, given the significant number of people and investments that have been made in designing a literacy program, in this example, that is aligned towards passing the state test, it's really hard to unravel it, right? It's really hard to undo it because you got, 133 elementary schools, et cetera, that you got to change.
Well, hold on a minute. So it's not as if we are even meeting the standard of the test. I mean, 50% of our kids don't read at grade level. So
that's something. So
even by that standard, we are not meeting anything.
Yeah. So let's pull that thread a little bit, right? So one of the things that I did, because I noticed that, right? I'm like, wait a second, we have more kids in abject poverty. We have more kids who have never been to school coming from Central and South America. We have an issue here with English language. I'm like seeing it coming up. I'm like, we don't really have a strategy, because our strategy was based more on, the kind of what I would call sort of the average vulnerable kid, the kid who needs a little extra support, to get them over the bubble. And that was actually an NCLB era strategy, right? You take the average, the kids are just below average and push them up, right?
Say what NCLB is.
Oh, I'm sorry. No Child Left Behind. And when I proposed to the board that we invest, I think it was $1.5 million. Again, this is resource allocation. This is decision making. And I said, look, we need to put a little more money in, because we got English language learners coming up that we're going to have a problem. If $1.5 million is nothing in the budget, I got pushback, right? Judy Daka said, well, I'm not going to support $1.5 million for English language learners if we don't do the same thing for Black kids. And I'm like, well, actually, our Black kids, again, they weren't doing as well as some other kids. I'm like, we have a lot of resources there, but I don't have it's not the crisis that I have going on here. So that's kind of how people need to understand about how decisions get made to do something as seemingly straightforward as getting more resources where they need to be, right? When you want to change a teaching and learning approach or change an outcome.
But if you say no to that, how is that no going to be interpreted in the Black community?
Well, that's right. So there were some people that were, I know, pushing, that everything, you had to have the commensurate investment. And, my hope, which is not commensurate with reality, is that when people see the facts, they'll get it, right? They'll at least understand. They may not agree, with it, but at least they'll know that the decision was made with transparency and integrity. And remember, this was at a time when the budget was terrible, right? The county council, MOE, there have been major budget battles, and the board was not doing much to work with the county council. Well, I can't say, some board members were, I can't say the board, but the board, the county executive, they were not going to give us more money. So I would, even in a big budget, it was still counting pennies, right? Still making cuts. And you know, so yeah, it's going to be interpreted as, you know, what about us? But you also got the gifted and talented folks saying the same thing. What about us? Right. You also got the special ed folks saying, what about us? You get, right. So, and I got to say, my job is to look at the facts on the ground and to make a recommendation to the board about what I see as the most urgent, you know, and pressing issues that have to be addressed with the funds we have, not to try to give everything to everybody. That doesn't solve problems.
Okay, let's talk about the pandemic and its effects on MCPS and more broadly on K-12 education. What are you most concerned about in the post-pandemic world? How does that apply to MCPS?
So I'm most concerned about the continued over-reliance on an obsession with standardized tests as the measure of what we've lost or what the metric should be for improvement. And there's no doubt that there are kids that had some significant, you know, we've called losses that were hurt by not being in school and need to now catch up to get to standards. But it exposed so many things about public education that we need to really reckon with before we just buy tutors to get more kids, you know, support, which isn't really working, right? Or just think that, well, if we can just catch them up in literacy and math, everything will be okay. It's not like we've been able, and when I say we, I mean broadly in American public education, has been able to do that before. I think there's this real push, and I talk about this in my most recent on leadership article for Kappa Magazine about the value proposition of school, right? And I think there's a two-part aspect to that. One is kids are kind of calling BS on us, right? You know, there are all these behavior problems in schools, there are all these significant issues, and I get it. But as I was talking to one friend of mine, actually Jen Webster, who was a high school principal in Montgomery County and now is up, and she was a district leader and is now the number 2 up in Washington County. She was telling me a story about how, you know, one of the high school kids she was talking to had been misbehaving, said, well, miss, you know, I can get what you're giving me in class right now. I used to be able to get sitting at home on my Chromebook in my pajamas. Why do I need to come to school? And she's kind of right? What are we doing differently to engage kids in different ways? I was talking to my own son the other day because he came home sick. I was like, well, you miss anything like that? It's all in slides. I can just log on. I'm like, so why go to school? It's like, well, I get a little more help when I'm there and I'm engaged, you know, and social and all that kind of stuff. So rethinking actually what we're teaching kids and what learning should look like, I think, is one of the major issues that we're confronting.
Well, rethink aloud a little bit and say what it is that you want changed.
If we now know that there's facility amongst teachers and kids to put things online, it really thinks, well, we should be flipping the classroom, right? And flipping the classroom is where kids kind of get some of the basic content, maybe, you know, for homework, whatever else, and then the class is really designed around engagement and conversation, some of the higher order application of those ideas, you know, and some problem solving rather than just regurgitation. The other piece coming out of the pandemic that I think is really important around the sort of value proposition and the advent of the right wing, you know, movement to just try to destroy public education is that schools serve a community and they serve a community purpose. And we have to think of how we can use the educative process to really invite folks who may have different views into a conversation about what we want as a community and what our shared values are, right? Even if it's totally abhorrent to us and the, you know, Moms for Liberty and Christopher Rufo kind of right-wing crazies, you know, are terrible. But there are a whole bunch of people that are supporting that because they just don't know, right? They don't know the history of America. They don't know the history of redlining. They don't know how our systems have been designed to oppress many and privilege few. And educators have a responsibility to invite them into a conversation that builds community. And I'd like to see schools serve that function.
Right. 2 years after the pandemic, health is literally the most ridiculed class in MCPS high schools.
Yep.
Everybody wants to take it during summer when it doesn't matter.
I know.
And can you imagine that? I mean, after the pandemic, health is the most laughed at class.
Right. So it's funny because actually I have a piece coming out about this, the experience that I had with looking at my ninth graders schedule for next year and thinking about course selection and health, tech ed, all these requirements that exist. Even, why do you need to take PE? The kid's a very competitive swimmer who is in great shape. Why do you take PE? Right. Yeah. I mean, I think those are the questions we need to confront.
Do you have any ideas on how MCPS can now, at this point, improve school leadership?
So I think, everyone out there is struggling with this. I think that there's probably a few things. One is there needs to be more support for principals, and everything, in my view, should be aligned to principal support. So you need a smaller ratio, and the Wallace Foundation has done some really good work on this, but you need a smaller ratio of principal to principal supervisors, right? Instead of having 20 or 30 principals to supervise, 10, maybe 15 is a much better ratio. The other question becomes, how do other central office functions support that principal? So if you're in special education, if you're an English language learner, if you are in curriculum, literacy, math, what you do in terms of putting in a new program, right, allocating some new resources, making some adjustments, supporting teachers, has to be around the principal's vision for that school. Right? Not about, here's a great program, we're just going to have all the teachers do it. It's like, no, Sunil, you're the principal of X school. What's your vision for it? Right? So you look at a guy like, Damon, when we put him into Richard Montgomery and the great work he did there, like, what's your vision and how do all these other central office functions support your vision? Right? And not get in the way of it. Look, you got mandates, you got compliance, I get it. But you want to make sure that the principal has the ability to lead.
Josh Starr, thank you for coming on I Hate Politics. I hope MCPS will do better than run for second.
Well, I hope so too. I'm a taxpayer. My 3 kids, I still have 1 in the system, 2 graduated from it. Thanks for having me on, Sunil. Appreciate it.
Would it be so hard to calibrate your lies? That would reduce the element of surprise. I wouldn't bet upon an outcome of success. Leave behind destruction, a heaping hot mess.
You're listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. What lessons can we draw from my conversation with former MCPS superintendent and now MCPS parent, Josh Starr? First, in keeping with the reason for this podcast, school decisions are political. Education policy is political. I've heard many people say that education should stand above politics. Truth is, public education, or indeed anything public, is always political. In the progressive era in the early 20th century, Maryland erected a school governance model to remove politics from education. They made school boards nonpartisan in the hope that high-minded local denizens would rise above politics. This did not happen. While Montgomery County school boards have featured some long-tenured superintendents, including Josh Starr's predecessor, Jerry Wiest, it has also experienced conflict and turmoil in how MCPS has been governed. Starr talked about Wiest and his style. In county history, Wiest, who was superintendent from the late 1990s to 2010, is legendary. I've heard stories where he would convene county council members, union leaders, others on his deck, serve the best scotch, and iron out school budgets. This was possible in a decade of plenty. The county was growing and flush. Money was not an issue that it became after the 2008 financial crisis. Josh Starr came in when money was scarce, but the county was still growing rapidly in population. Nothing brings out political infighting faster than budget cutting. Second, Starr said something quite remarkable. Montgomery County generally, and MCPS specifically, are in a race to be second. There are other ways I have heard people express this sentiment. Given the enormous wealth and high education levels in Montgomery County, the county does better than other jurisdictions, but it doesn't try to break the mold of how things are done. The county is constantly looking over its shoulder to see how others are doing it. Yet others see in the county's wealth and education the cause for the big equity issues that exist between East and West County, between Down and Up County. The successes of some mask the difficulties of others. There are comparable jurisdictions out there. Starr came from one in Stamford, Connecticut. Fairfax, Virginia is usually what Montgomery County compares itself to. It is noteworthy that those jurisdictions are roughly similar to Montgomery in outcomes as well. The race to be second then seems to be a response of status quo, peering into uncertainty, and then taking the safe route. Third, the idea of pandemic learning loss has been widely embraced. By the measures used to capture the idea, learning loss is real. Yet it is worth asking if these measures are useful. Crises present opportunity as they present danger. The rise of standardized testing since the mid-1990s has been mind-boggling. What started as a way to demonstrate lack of equity, the differential in performance between social groups, has now evolved into an idea of data-driven education. As if education or any other social activity before was pursued free of evidentiary basis. There are costs to collecting data. No matter the amount of code companies can write. And the cost is class time, it's teacher time, it's exploration time. We still need to know students who are falling behind. But most teachers can probably rattle off those names if we woke them up mid-sleep. That's all for this episode. You've been listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from CatScan, a Washington, D.C. band of three friends who have known each other since kindergarten. Paul Chaparis on bass and vocals, Mason Shelby on keyboards and vocals, and Kevin Kingsley on guitars. Their music is available on major streaming platforms and on Bandcamp. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihp.org. I hope you will subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
cited sources illegitimate. All these guys are so completely full of it. They're mentally unfit. But I can't believe the words that he